The church was bathed in a somber light, the faint glow of candles flickering against stained glass windows. Friends, colleagues, and distant relatives of Mark Ellison gathered to mourn a man they believed had led an admirable life. His wife, Claire, sat at the front pew, dressed in a modest black dress, her face an unyielding mask of grief. Their daughter, Lily, clung to her side, unaware of the storm brewing beneath her mother's stoic demeanor. As the priest intoned the prayers, a figure entered the church. A striking woman in her early 30s, her movements deliberate, her presence magnetic. The murmurs began immediately, spreading like wildfire among the mourners. The woman, later identified as Vanessa Wright, strode confidently down the aisle and took a seat just 3 rows behind Claire. Claire noticed. Of course she did. Vanessa wasn't a stranger. Claire had seen her before, in photographs Mark thought he'd hidden, in messages she pretended not to notice during his late-night calls. It wasn't just suspicion. Claire knew. But she had waited, hoping the charade could end without the need for confrontation. Now Mark was gone, leaving the mess of his double life for her to untangle. And Vanessa's presence at his funeral wasn't just an insult. It was a provocation. After the service, as mourners trickled out to the reception hall, Claire approached Vanessa. Their eyes locked, and Vanessa stood, her expression a mix of defiance and—
Before I continue, my friends, I kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel. It only takes a second for you, but it's a huge boost of motivation for me to keep creating videos. I'd also greatly appreciate your comments. Thank you for your support. Now, let's get back to the story.
Women exited the church into the chilly afternoon air. The wind carried the faint scent of rain, adding an edge to the charged atmosphere. Claire turned to face Vanessa, her composure crumbling just enough to reveal a simmering rage. "How dare you come here?" Claire hissed. "To his funeral? After everything you've done?" Vanessa's face paled, but she refused to back down. "I loved him too, Claire. You think this is easy for me?" Claire laughed bitterly, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Easy for you? You have no idea what love is. You were just his escape. A fantasy he indulged when the responsibilities of real life got too heavy." "That's not fair," Vanessa shot back. "He told me you were the one who made him miserable, that he stayed for Lily, but he didn't love you anymore. And you believed him?" Claire's voice rose, trembling with emotion. "He was a liar. To me, to you, to everyone. He lied until the day he died." Vanessa faltered. For the first time, doubt flickered across her face. "What are you saying?" Claire stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Mark's death wasn't an accident. He didn't just collapse on the side of the road. He was poisoned." Vanessa's breath hitched. "Poisoned? By who?" Claire's lips curved into a cold, mirthless smile. "That's the question, isn't it?" The revelation left Vanessa stunned, and before she could respond, Claire turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement. Inside the reception hall, the mourners continued their hushed conversations, oblivious to the tension unraveling outside. As Claire re-entered the hall, her composure firmly back in place, she glanced at the small, ornate urn holding Mark's ashes. She knew the truth would eventually surface, but for now, she had one goal: to ensure her husband's secrets didn't tarnish the life she had rebuilt for herself and her daughter. Vanessa, meanwhile, lingered in the shadows, questions swirling in her mind. Had Claire killed Mark? Or had someone else, someone neither of them suspected, taken matters into their own hands? One thing was certain: Mark's death was only the beginning of a much darker story. The days following the funeral were suffocatingly quiet. Claire kept herself busy with the logistics of closing Mark's accounts, fielding endless condolences, and comforting Lily, who had started asking uncomfortable questions. "Mom, why does everyone keep saying Daddy looked so healthy?" Lily's wide eyes searched her mother's face for answers. "If he wasn't sick, why did he die?" Claire's stomach twisted. "Sometimes, sweetheart, things happen that we can't explain, but we'll be okay. I promise." At night, though the quiet was unbearable. Claire sat alone in the kitchen, staring at her glass of wine. She replayed her confrontation with Vanessa in her mind, each word dissected for hidden meanings. The memory of Vanessa's shock when Claire mentioned poison was genuine. Claire was sure of it. But that didn't mean Vanessa was innocent. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. After a few rings, a deep voice answered. "Detective Harris." "David, it's Claire Ellison," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I need your help." Detective David Harris arrived the next morning, his towering frame and stern expression a reminder of his years in law enforcement. He had known Claire and Mark during their early years of marriage, when Claire worked as a paralegal and David was a young detective. They had drifted apart over time, but Claire still trusted him. "You think Mark was murdered?" Harris asked bluntly, his eyes narrowing. Claire nodded, sliding a folder across the table. "The autopsy report. Cause of death. Acute cardiac arrest. But there's something off. Look at the talk screen." Harris flipped through the papers, his brow furrowed. "Trace amounts of aconitine. That's rare. It's from Monkshood, isn't it?" Claire nodded again. "Exactly. And it's not something you just stumble upon. Someone wanted him dead." Harris leaned back in his chair. "And you think Vanessa Wright had something to do with it?" "She had a motive," Claire said. "Mark was planning to end things with her. I found emails he never sent, drafts where he told her it was over. Maybe she couldn't handle it." Harris scratched his chin. "It's a lead. But if what you're saying is true, why would she show up at the funeral? Killers don't usually parade themselves around like that." "Unless she wanted to see my reaction," Claire countered. "To see if I knew." Harris considered this, then stood. "I'll look into it. But Claire, I have to ask. Are you sure there's nothing you're not telling me?" Claire met his gaze evenly. "I'm telling you everything I know." Harris left with the file, but Claire could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. She couldn't blame him. The truth was, she wasn't entirely convinced herself. As much as she wanted to believe Vanessa was the culprit, a nagging doubt lingered. Mark's world was far more complex than she'd ever realized. Vanessa wasn't as composed as she had been at the funeral. She sat in her apartment, her hands trembling as she scrolled through old text messages from Mark. She had loved him, truly, and she believed he had loved her too. But Claire's words about his lies gnawed at her. Then there was the poison. She hadn't killed him. She knew that much. But the possibility that someone else had, that Mark's death wasn't the tragic accident she had been told, left her reeling. She needed answers. Before she could stop herself, she grabbed her phone and dialed Claire's number. "What do you want?" Claire's voice was cold. "We need to talk," Vanessa said. "Face to face. I don't have anything else to say to you." "Then just listen," Vanessa pleaded. "I didn't kill him, but if what you said is true, someone else did. And don't you want to know who?" There was a long pause and then Claire sighed. "Fine. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. The cafe on 5th. Vanessa hung up, her heart pounding. She didn't trust Claire, but she had no choice. Answers were buried somewhere between the life Mark had shown the world and the one he had hidden. She only hoped they wouldn't destroy her in the process. At the cafe, Claire arrived 5 minutes early, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Vanessa entered a moment later, her face pale but determined. They sat across from each other, the tension between them palpable. "Start talking," Claire said. Vanessa hesitated, then pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag. "Mark gave me this 2 days before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should read it." Claire unfolded the paper. It wasn't a letter, it was a list. Names, dates, and dollar amounts. "What is this?" Claire demanded. "I don't know," Vanessa said. "But it's not innocent. Whatever Mark was involved in, it was dangerous. And now he's dead." Claire's hands trembled as she clutched the paper. She didn't know the names, but the amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars. She looked up at Vanessa, her expression unreadable. "Mark wasn't just lying to us," she said. "He was lying to everyone. And the deeper they dug, the more dangerous the truth would become. Detective Harris sat in his car, the engine idling as he stared at the folder Claire had given him. The mention of aconitine lingered in his mind. It wasn't just rare. It was almost impossible to trace unless you knew what to look for. He needed to follow up on the lead, but something about Claire's demeanor during their meeting unsettled him. She was holding something back, he was certain of it. He flipped open his laptop and began a deeper dive into Mark Ellison's life. His search uncovered something peculiar. Mark had recently opened a series of offshore accounts, funneling large sums of money through shell companies. The transactions stopped abruptly 2 days before his death. Harris's pulse quickened. Whatever Mark had been involved in, it wasn't just an affair. He made a call to a forensic accountant he trusted. "I need you to analyze these accounts. Send me everything you can find." At the cafe, Claire folded the paper Vanessa had given her and slipped it into her bag. Her mind raced as she considered the implications. The names didn't mean much to her, but the amounts were staggering. This wasn't just an affair or a petty crime. It was something bigger, something dangerous. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Claire asked, narrowing her eyes at Vanessa. Vanessa shook her head. "Do you think they'd believe me? The mistress of a married man shows up with a suspicious list after his death. They'd assume I made it up. Or worse, that I was involved." Claire studied her carefully. Vanessa was scared, but there was something else. Something darker. Fear mingled with guilt. Claire wondered what part of the story Vanessa wasn't telling. "I need you to leave," Claire said finally. "Stay out of this. For your own good." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "I can't. Not until I know who killed him." Before Claire could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. A message from Detective Harris. "We need to talk. Now." ***. They met at a secluded bench in the park, far from prying eyes. Harris held a tablet in his hand, its screen glowing with financial data. "You were right," he said without preamble. Mark was into something deep. Offshore accounts, shell companies. He was laundering money, big money. We're talking millions. Claire's stomach churned. "Who for?" "I don't know yet, but the accounts tie back to a known arms dealer." Harris hesitated. "And here's the kicker. One of the names tied to the accounts is on this list you gave me." Claire's heart skipped a beat. "What name?" Harris pointed to the screen. "Jonathan Crane. Former business partner of Mark's from years ago." "Did you know him?" Claire nodded slowly. He and Mark had a falling out. Something about a failed venture. They hadn't spoken in years. "Well, Crane's name is all over this. My guess?" Mark got back in touch. And it didn't end well. Claire felt the weight of the revelation press down on her. If Crane was involved, then Mark's death was more than personal. It was business. Ruthless, bloody business. Meanwhile, Vanessa sat in her car outside the cafe, replaying her conversation with Claire. Something didn't sit right. Claire's insistence that she stay out of it felt less like concern and more like a warning. Determined to dig deeper, Vanessa pulled out her phone and began searching for the names on the list. One name caught her eye: Jonathan Crane. She gasped. The name wasn't unfamiliar. She had seen it before, on documents in Mark's home office. Her stomach sank as she realized the connection. This wasn't just about Mark's secrets. She was already entangled in them. That night, Claire woke to a sound outside her window, a faint rustling, followed by the creak of the gate. She slipped out of bed and peered through the curtains, her breath catching when she saw a figure in the shadows. Grabbing a flashlight and her phone, she made her way downstairs. The front door creaked open, and Claire stepped outside, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady despite the fear tightening her throat. The figure stepped into the light. It was Vanessa. "What the hell are you doing here?" Claire hissed. Vanessa held up her hands. "I need to show you something. I couldn't wait." Claire's eyes darted to the street, searching for anyone who might be watching. "This isn't safe. Come inside." Once inside, Vanessa handed Claire her phone. "Look at this." Crane wasn't just Mark's business partner. He's the reason Mark started the offshore accounts. He forced him into it. Claire stared at the screen. Vanessa had uncovered a web of transactions, emails, and documents linking Crane to the money laundering operation. Her chest tightened. This wasn't just about Mark's infidelity or greed. It was about survival. "We need to go to Harris," Claire said. Vanessa shook her head. "No. Crane will know. If he finds out we're onto him, we're as good as dead." Claire set the phone down, her mind racing. She hated Vanessa for what she represented. But in this moment, they were on the same side. Mark's death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much darker. And Crane was coming for them both. Claire barely slept that night. Every shadow outside her window felt like a threat. Every creak in the house a harbinger of danger. She sat at the kitchen table, the list Vanessa had given her spread out in front of her. The names blurred as her mind raced. If Jonathan Crane had forced Mark into laundering money, then his death wasn't just a murder. It was a message. By morning, Claire had made a decision. She dialed Detective Harris, her voice low but urgent. "We need to meet. It's about Crane." Harris met Claire at a diner on the edge of town, his expression grim. She slid Vanessa's phone across the table, the screen glowing with evidence of Crane's dealings. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "It doesn't matter," Claire said. "What matters is that Crane is behind this. He forced Mark into laundering money, and now Mark's dead." Harris's eyes narrowed. "You're telling me Crane killed him?" Claire hesitated. "Or he had someone else do it. Mark was planning to get out. He was drafting emails to cut ties. Crane must have found out." Harris leaned back in his seat, his jaw tight. "This changes everything. Crane isn't just some disgruntled ex-partner. He's dangerous. And if he knows you're digging into this, you're a target." "I don't have a choice," Claire said. "If Crane killed Mark, I need to know. For Lily's sake." Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'll look into it. But you need to stay out of this, Claire. Let me handle it." Claire nodded, but she knew better. Crane wouldn't wait for the police to catch up. She had to protect herself. And Vanessa. Later that day, Vanessa paced her apartment, paranoia creeping in. She'd taken every precaution. Changing her passwords, locking her doors, even keeping a knife under her pillow. But it wasn't enough. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Her phone buzzed, startling her. The caller ID was blocked. Hesitantly, she answered. "Vanessa, right?" A deep, unfamiliar voice drawled. "You've been asking a lot of questions." Her blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "You know who I am," the voice continued, calm and deliberate. "And you know what I'm capable of. If you value your life, you'll stop." The line went dead. Vanessa's hands trembled as she set the phone down. Crane had found her. She grabbed her bag and keys, her instincts screaming at her to run. But where could she go? That evening, Claire heard a frantic knock at her door. When she opened it, Vanessa stood there, her face pale and eyes wild. "He called me," Vanessa blurted. "Crane. He knows." Claire pulled her inside and locked the door. "What did he say?" "That I need to stop digging. That he'll come after me if I don't." Claire's mind raced. Crane's reach was longer than she'd feared. If he was willing to threaten Vanessa, he wouldn't stop there. She turned to Vanessa, her expression hard. "We have to fight back." Vanessa stared at her, incredulous. "Fight back? Against him? He'll kill us." "Not if we get to him first," Claire said. She grabbed the list and the phone, her voice steady with resolve. "We have evidence, enough to expose him. If we can get this to someone higher up, someone Crane can't buy, we have a chance." Vanessa hesitated, then nodded. "What do we do?" Claire's plan was risky. Harris was trustworthy, but Crane had connections that could jeopardize the investigation. They needed to go above him, straight to federal authorities. But getting the evidence there without Crane finding out would require careful planning. The next day, Claire and Vanessa drove to a secure drop point Harris had recommended. A contact in the FBI would pick up the evidence and begin building a case against Crane. As they approached the location, Claire noticed a black SUV parked nearby. Her heart sank. "They're watching us," she whispered. Vanessa glanced at the SUV, panic rising. "What do we do?" Claire tightened her grip on the wheel. "We finish this." They parked a block away and walked to the drop point, a nondescript bench in a public park. Claire placed the envelope under the bench, her movements quick and deliberate. As they turned to leave, the SUV roared to life. "Run!" Claire shouted. They sprinted through the park, dodging trees and scattering startled pedestrians. The SUV tore across the grass, closing the distance. Vanessa stumbled, but Claire grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. Just as the SUV bore down on them, a police cruiser appeared, its lights flashing. The SUV skidded to a stop, then sped off. Harris emerged from the cruiser, his gun drawn. "Get in," he barked. Claire and Vanessa didn't hesitate. They piled into the cruiser as Harris peeled away, his face set in grim determination. "You two just made yourselves targets," he said. "But you might have just given us enough to bring Crane down." Claire glanced at Vanessa, their shared fear momentarily eclipsed by a spark of hope. Mark's death had left them shattered, but now they had a chance to fight back and to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The safe house Harris brought them to was small and unremarkable, tucked away in a quiet suburb. The blinds were drawn, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Claire and Vanessa sat at the kitchen table, their nerves raw. Harris leaned against the counter, speaking into his phone in a low voice. "Yeah, they've got the evidence. Crane's going to know they handed it off. We need eyes on his operation immediately," Harris said before hanging up. He turned to them, his expression severe. "The FBI has the file. They're moving fast, but Crane won't wait. You're both in serious danger." Vanessa hugged her arms, her voice trembling. "What happens now? Do we just hide here and hope for the best?" "No," Harris replied. "The FBI will protect you, but they need more to nail Crane. He's careful, never leaves a direct trail. If we're going to stop him, we need leverage." Claire frowned. "Leverage? What kind?" Harris hesitated. "Something that forces Crane's hand. Something only you two might know." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a phone vibrating. Vanessa glanced down and froze. Her phone, lying on the table, was buzzing with a message from an unknown number. She opened it hesitantly. "You think you're safe? You're not. Leave this alone or you'll regret it." She showed the message to Claire and Harris, her hands shaking. Harris cursed under his breath. "They've already found your number. That means they're close." Claire's jaw tightened. "We can't just sit here. What kind of leverage are you talking about?" Harris sat down, his tone softer but no less urgent. "Something Crane values enough to make him desperate. Money, associates, a weakness. Anything. Think, Claire. You were his wife for years. Did Mark ever mention something about Crane that we could use?" Claire closed her eyes, searching her memory. She thought of Mark's late-night phone calls, the cryptic messages, the tension that had simmered in their marriage long before she discovered his affair. Then it hit her. "Mark had a ledger," she said slowly. "A physical book. He said it was insurance. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now." He kept it hidden in his study. Vanessa's eyes widened. "Do you know where it is?" Claire nodded. "There's a safe behind the bookshelf. I don't know the combination, but Mark used to write passwords on sticky notes. They'd be nearby." Harris leaned forward, his expression sharp. "That ledger could be the key, but going back to your house is a risk. Crane's people might be watching." Claire straightened her shoulders. "If that book can stop him, it's worth the risk." Under the cover of darkness, they drove to Claire's house in an unmarked car. Harris parked a block away and handed Claire a small earpiece. "I'll be watching from here. If anything looks off, I'll pull you out. You've got 10 minutes, no more." Claire and Vanessa moved quickly, slipping through the back gate and into the house. It was eerily silent, the air heavy with the sense that they weren't alone. Claire led Vanessa to the study, her heart pounding. Behind the bookshelf, the safe sat just as she remembered. Claire rummaged through Mark's desk drawers, her hands trembling. Finally, she found a sticky note with a series of numbers. "Got it," she whispered. She entered the code, and the safe clicked open. Inside was the ledger, a worn leather-bound book filled with meticulous records, names, dates, transactions. Claire's breath caught as she realized the depth of Mark's involvement. This wasn't just money laundering. It was a map of Crane's entire network. "We've got it," Claire said, holding up the book. Vanessa's relief was short-lived. A creak on the floorboards made them both freeze. Someone was in the house. Harris's voice crackled in Claire's ear. "Get out now. There's a car parked across the street, and the driver's not alone." Claire motioned to Vanessa, and they crept toward the back door. Just as they reached it, a shadow appeared in the hallway. A man with a gun. "Stop right there," he growled. Claire's mind raced. She gripped the ledger tightly, realizing its value. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "This book is the only thing keeping Crane safe. If we die, it goes straight to the FBI." The man hesitated, his grip on the gun faltering. It was enough. Harris burst through the back door, his weapon drawn. "Drop it," he shouted. The man turned, but Harris was faster, firing a single shot into his shoulder. The gunman crumpled to the floor, groaning in pain. "Move," Harris barked. Claire and Vanessa ran, clutching the ledger as Harris covered their retreat. They didn't stop until they were back in the car, speeding away from the house. At the safe house, Harris placed the ledger in a lockbox. "This is it," he said, his voice heavy with relief. "With this, the FBI can dismantle Crane's operation." Claire sank into a chair, exhaustion overtaking her. Vanessa sat beside her, her face pale but determined. They had risked everything, but they had the leverage they needed. Harris's phone buzzed. He answered, his expression darkening. "What? When?" He hung up and turned to them, his jaw clenched. "Crane knows we have the ledger. He's not going to run. He's coming for you." For Claire and Vanessa, the nightmare wasn't over. Crane wasn't the type to surrender without a fight. And now, they were the only obstacle standing between him and his empire. The safe house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap as the night wore on. Claire paced the small living room, her thoughts spinning. Vanessa sat curled in a chair, clutching a mug of untouched coffee, her eyes darting to every shadow. Harris remained at the table, scanning updates from his contacts, his expression grim. "We don't have much time," Harris said finally. "The FBI is moving on Crane's operation, but he's too powerful to go quietly. He knows exactly where to hit us." Vanessa glanced up. "What does that mean? He'll send more men?" Harris nodded. "He'll try to recover the ledger and eliminate any witnesses. You two are the biggest threats to him right now." Claire stopped pacing and turned to Harris. "What do we do? Just wait for him to come to us?" Harris shook his head. "We stay ahead of him. The FBI has a plan to extract you both and get you into protective custody. But we need to hold out until they're ready." "When?" Claire asked, her voice sharp. Harris's hesitation said it all. 12 hours. The hours crawled by. Harris reinforced the doors and windows, his movements efficient but tense. Claire sat beside Vanessa, her hand gripping the ledger. The weight of its secrets pressed on her. The names inside were more than just numbers. They were lives, people Crane had manipulated and destroyed. Vanessa broke the silence. "Do you think Mark knew this would happen?" Claire's jaw tightened. "He must have. That's why he kept the ledger. He wasn't trying to escape for himself. He was trying to protect us. He just didn't realize how dangerous Crane really was." Vanessa looked down at her hands. "Do you hate him? For lying to you?" Claire considered the question. "I did. But now, I think he was trying to do the right thing in the end. It just cost him everything." Close to midnight, Harris's phone buzzed with an alert. He swiped through it, his expression hardening. "They're here." Claire and Vanessa froze. "How many?" Claire whispered. Harris checked the security cameras he had installed around the perimeter. 4 men, dressed in black, were circling the house. Each was armed, their movements precise. These weren't random thugs, they were professionals. "Stay here," Harris ordered. He pulled a second handgun from his bag and passed it to Claire. "Do you know how to use this?" Claire nodded, her grip steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Vanessa stared at the weapon, her face pale. "I don't." "You won't need to," Harris said. "Just stay out of sight." The first attack came fast. A flash grenade shattered one of the windows, flooding the room with light and sound. Claire dragged Vanessa to the floor as Harris returned fire, the sharp cracks of his gun echoing in the confined space. "They're breaching," Harris shouted. "Claire, take Vanessa and the ledger. Go to the basement." Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed Vanessa by the arm and pulled her toward the basement door. As they descended the stairs, the sounds of gunfire and breaking glass filled the house. In the basement, Claire locked the door behind them and pushed a heavy shelf in front of it. "We have to keep the ledger safe," she said, her voice shaking. Vanessa nodded, tears streaming down her face. "What about Harris?" Claire hesitated. "He'll hold them off as long as he can." Upstairs, Harris moved like a man possessed. He fired precise shots, taking down 2 of the intruders before retreating to a better position. But the remaining men were relentless, their movements coordinated. Harris knew he couldn't hold them forever. "FBI's on the way," he muttered to himself, firing another shot. "Just a little longer." In the basement, the sound of footsteps above made Claire's heart pound. One of the intruders had made it past Harris. She motioned for Vanessa to stay quiet, then positioned herself near the door, the gun trembling in her hand. The door creaked as the intruder pushed against it. The shelf held, but only barely. Claire aimed at the spot where the door would open, her finger hovering over the trigger. The door burst open, sending the shelf crashing to the ground. The intruder stepped inside, his gun raised. Claire fired, the shot ringing out in the confined space. The man crumpled to the ground, his weapon skidding across the floor. Vanessa screamed, but Claire didn't flinch. She grabbed the ledger and pulled Vanessa toward the small basement window. "We're getting out of here." They climbed through the window and into the backyard, the cold night air shocking against their skin. Harris's voice crackled through Claire's earpiece. "I've got the last one pinned. Run. Now." Claire didn't argue. She and Vanessa sprinted toward the tree line, the ledger clutched tightly against her chest. In the distance, the wail of sirens grew louder. Help was coming, but so was Crane's wrath. When the FBI agents finally arrived, the scene was chaos. 2 intruders were dead, and Harris was wounded but alive. Claire and Vanessa were found huddled near the edge of the forest, the ledger still in their possession. "It's over," one of the agents assured them. "Crane's finished." But Claire knew better. Crane was powerful, and men like him didn't give up easily. As the agents led her and Vanessa to safety, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of another fight. Crane might fall, but his empire wouldn't crumble without a war. And Claire was ready for it. The final confrontation with Jonathan Crane came quicker than anyone anticipated. Less than a week after the FBI raid, Claire sat in a secure federal facility, the ledger now the cornerstone of the Bureau's investigation. Vanessa remained under protection, her fear palpable but her resolve steady. They both knew that Crane, even cornered, wouldn't go down without a fight. Detective Harris, his arm in a sling from the firefight, joined Claire in the sterile interrogation room. Across the table, an FBI agent laid out the plan. "We've frozen Crane's accounts, arrested several of his key associates, and dismantled his immediate operations. But Crane himself is still out there," the agent said. "He's made no attempts to flee, which means he's planning something." Claire clenched her fists. "What does he want?" "You," the agent replied, his gaze steady. "You and the ledger. He thinks if he eliminates you, his empire can recover. But we're going to use that to our advantage." The plan was simple, yet dangerous. Claire would act as bait, luring Crane into a controlled environment where federal agents would apprehend him. Despite her fear, she agreed. She couldn't keep running, and she couldn't let Crane escape justice. Vanessa protested. You're putting her life at risk. Isn't there another way? There isn't, Claire said, her voice firm. If we don't stop him now, he'll never stop coming for us. This ends tonight. The meeting was set at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Claire arrived first, the ledger clutched in her hands. She stood in the dimly lit space, the cold air biting through her coat. Around her, federal agents and tactical teams lay hidden, their weapons trained on every possible entry point. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. Then came the sound of footsteps. Crane emerged from the shadows, his sharp suit a jarring contrast to the decrepit surroundings. His smile was chilling, his confidence unnerving. "Claire," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I have to admit, I'm impressed. You've caused me more trouble than I ever expected." Claire's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "It's over, Crane. The FBI has everything. Your accounts, your network. It's finished." Crane chuckled, shaking his head. "Do you really think I built all this without contingencies? You hand over that ledger, and I'll let you walk away. No more threats, no more games." "You're lying," Claire shot back. "Even if I gave this to you, you'd kill me." Crane's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, but it doesn't matter. This ends my way." He motioned, and two armed men stepped out from the shadows. Claire's pulse quickened as they advanced, but before they could reach her, the air exploded with the sound of gunfire. The tactical teams moved like a storm, their precision overwhelming Crane's men. Claire dropped to the ground as bullets whizzed overhead. Crane ducked behind a pillar, his calm demeanor shattered as the federal agents closed in. Harris, leading the charge, shouted, "Crane, drop your weapon and surrender." But Crane wasn't the surrendering type. He fired wildly, his desperation clear. Harris returned fire, pinning him in place. Realizing he was outmatched, Crane made a break for an exit, but Claire stepped into his path, the ledger held high. "Looking for this?" she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. Crane froze, his gun trained on her. "You don't have the nerve." Claire's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe not, but they do." Behind her, the agents surrounded Crane, their weapons drawn. He looked around, his smirk faltering as he realized he was out of options. Slowly, he dropped his gun and raised his hands. The aftermath was swift. Crane was arrested, his empire dismantled piece by piece. The ledger provided a roadmap for the FBI to pursue his remaining associates, ensuring they couldn't rebuild. For Claire and Vanessa, it was finally over. Weeks later, Claire stood in her living room, watching Lily play in the backyard. The sun was setting, casting the yard in a warm, golden light. Harris sat on the couch, a fresh cup of coffee in his hand. "You did good, Claire," he said. "Most people wouldn't have had the courage to face him." Claire smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for courage. I did it for Lily. She deserves a life free of fear." Harris nodded. "She'll have that now." Vanessa arrived shortly after, her demeanor lighter than it had been in weeks. She handed Claire a small package. "I thought you might want this." Claire opened it to find a framed photo of Mark, Lily, and herself from years ago. Her eyes welled with tears as she placed it on the mantel. "Thank you," Claire said softly. Vanessa smiled. "We survived. That's what matters." As the evening faded into night, Claire allowed herself to breathe deeply for the first time in months. The shadows that had haunted her family were gone, and though the scars remained, they were free. The fight was over, and this time they had won.